stop. Before you skip past this, what if every single thing that has ever broken you, every betrayal, every loss, every sleepless night replaying what someone said, what if none of it ever had the power to hurt you at all? Not because you're wrong for feeling it, not because the pain wasn't real, but because you've been running software in your mind that nobody ever told you could be updated. Right now, somewhere in America, a soldier is returning from war with wounds that no X-ray can find. A mother is lying awake at 3 a.m. rehearsing a conversation that ended 3 years ago. A young executive is sitting in a corner office, successful by every measurable standard, and wondering why nothing feels like enough. The common thread? They're all fighting an invisible enemy, and they don't know its name yet. You're about to learn it. Over 2,000 years ago, in the dust and chains of ancient captivity, a man with nothing, no freedom, no wealth, no physical wholeness, discovered something that would quietly reshape the thinking of presidents, generals, billionaires, and Olympic champions. His discovery didn't require money. It didn't require status. It didn't even require a body that worked properly. It only required one thing: a mind willing to see itself clearly. This audiobook is about that discovery. It's about the invisible shield the wisest humans in history built around themselves, not to keep life out, but to stay standing when life tried to knock them down. By the time you finish listening, you will not be the same person who pressed play. Not because you'll become cold, not because you'll stop feeling, but because you'll finally understand the only real difference between people who are destroyed by life's hardest moments and people who are forged by them. Are you ready? Then let's begin. The lie you've been living. Why everything you think you know about emotional pain is wrong. There is a lie at the center of your emotional life. A lie so old, so deeply woven into the way you process reality, that you've never once thought to question it. And this lie, not the hardships themselves, not the people who wronged you, not the losses that hit like freight trains, is the single greatest source of your suffering. Here it is: that the world outside you has the power to hurt you. That when someone betrays you, they are the cause of your pain. That when an opportunity collapses, the disappointment comes from the event itself. That when love ends, the leaving is what breaks you. This feels so obviously true that reading it challenged probably made you defensive. Of course other people hurt you. Of course the events of your life cause your suffering. What kind of nonsense is this? Stay with it, because what you're about to read is going to restructure something fundamental in how you experience being alive. Here is the actual truth, backed by ancient wisdom and confirmed by modern neuroscience. Nothing and no one outside yourself has ever caused your suffering, not once, not ever. Every moment of emotional pain you have ever experienced was constructed inside your own mind, by your thoughts, by the stories you assembled around raw events. The events themselves were neutral. You supplied the meaning. You built the suffering. This is not a motivational slogan. This is not toxic positivity asking you to smile through grief. This is the most practically transformative insight in all of recorded human psychology. And when you really see it, not just intellectually but in your bones, your relationship with pain changes forever. Let's make this concrete. Two people open identical text messages from their partners. 4 words: "We need to talk." Person 1 immediately goes into freefall. Their chest tightens. Their mind sprints through worst-case scenarios. The relationship is over. They've done something unforgivable. They're about to be left. They spend the next 4 hours in low-grade agony, barely functional, heart already mourning a loss that hasn't happened. Person 2 reads the same 4 words and thinks, probably wants to plan the weekend. They keep going about their afternoon until the conversation actually happens. Same message, same words, same situation. 2 completely different emotional universes. What changed? Not the event, the interpretation. Person 1 didn't experience pain because of the text. They experienced pain because of the story their mind automatically wrote about the text. Person 2 had no such story, so there was no pain. The message, the actual event, was neutral, completely neutral. 4 words on a screen. It had no emotional content of its own. All the suffering was supplied internally, constructed in the milliseconds between receiving information and making meaning out of it. Now scale that principle outward. Apply it to every difficult thing that's ever happened to you. The breakup that devastated you. That was a series of events and words. What broke you was the story you told about what those events meant about your future, your worth, your ability to be loved. The job rejection that stung for weeks. That was a decision someone else made. What created the wound was the narrative you attached. I'm not good enough. I never get what I want. Things never work out for me. The friendship that ended and left you feeling abandoned, that was a person making a choice. What hurt you was the meaning you assigned to that choice. The event is always just data, information about what happened. Your suffering comes from what you tell yourself that information means. The ancient philosophers of the East and West both stumbled upon this same radical insight through different routes. A wandering Chinese sage named Zhuangzi wrote in the 3rd century BC that the mind is the master of all things, that the person who controls their inner world cannot be shaken by any storm in the outer world. His student would eventually write, when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. Half a world away, in a desert city that would become one of history's crossroads, a different tradition was forming the same conclusion. The scholars of Persia's great academies, men who had survived invasions, collapses, upheavals that would crush most modern minds, wrote again and again about the wall between events and the mind, about how that wall, properly built, makes a person unreachable. But of all the voices across time who have spoken this truth, perhaps none said it more powerfully than a man born into chains. A man we'll meet properly in the next chapter, whose insight was so precise, so uncompromising, that it has survived more than 2,000 years because no one has ever improved upon it. Here's why this matters right now, in your life, today. Every time you felt like a victim of your circumstances, every time you've said, this person ruined my day, or that situation destroyed my confidence, you were, without knowing it, handing your power to something outside yourself. You were telling your nervous system that your inner state is at the mercy of external events. And once that becomes your operating assumption, you are permanently vulnerable, because external events never stop. Life doesn't run out of curveballs. If your peace depends on the world behaving the way you want it to, you will never, ever be at peace. Think about the mechanics of what happens when someone says something that hurts you. Sound waves travel through air and strike your eardrums. Your brain converts those waves into words. Those words trigger a cascade of thought associations. Those associations generate emotions. Those emotions produce the experience you call pain. At which precise step did the other person actually hurt you? They produced sound waves. That's the full extent of their power over your experience. Every single thing after that happened inside you. This doesn't mean the other person was kind or right or blameless. Maybe they were cruel. Maybe they were wrong. That's a separate question entirely. The question here is, who created your suffering? And the honest answer, the one that is both uncomfortable and liberating, is that you did. You're not weak for having done this. You were never taught otherwise. From childhood, you absorb the social contract that says when bad things happen, you feel bad, and the bad thing is the cause. This is the universal human story. It's deeply embedded in language itself. She hurt my feelings. He broke my heart. That situation destroyed me. All of these sentences locate the source of pain outside the self. All of them are grammatically confident and psychologically inaccurate. The most emotionally resilient people you'll ever meet, the ones who seem to navigate catastrophe with a quality you might mistake for coldness, but is actually something far more powerful, have learned, consciously or not, to separate the event from the meaning. They don't spend energy fighting reality. They don't construct elaborate internal dramas about what external events say about them. They process facts as facts and maintain their inner equilibrium because they understand at a deep level that their peace was never dependent on the world cooperating. This is the first and most essential insight in the entire system you're about to learn. Everything else, every technique, every practice, every framework is built on this foundation. Until you genuinely understand that your suffering is self-generated, you will keep looking for solutions in the wrong places. You'll keep trying to change other people's behavior. You'll keep trying to prevent difficult things from happening. You'll keep waiting for the world to calm down so you can finally feel okay. But the world will not calm down. It never has. It's not built to. Your mind, however, that's different terrain entirely. Your mind is where all your power lives, and right now, most of that power is being surrendered without you even noticing. That's about to change. The unchained mind, how history's most unlikely people became emotionally bulletproof. Around 60 AD, in a small provincial city near the Mediterranean coast, a boy was born into slavery. His name was Musonius. His master was a Roman official with a reputation for cruelty. By the age of 12, Musonius had watched his mother sold, his childhood friends auctioned off, and his own body used as a display of his owner's power, including having one of his legs deliberately broken and left to heal wrong, leaving him with a permanent limp that would follow him every single day for the rest of his life. By every external standard, this boy had nothing. No freedom, no property, no future he could choose. He didn't own the room he slept in, the sandals on his damaged foot, or a single hour of his own waking life. And yet, by the time he was 40, people were crossing oceans to hear him speak. Senators, military commanders, and merchants who controlled the fates of thousands sat at his feet to learn how to live. His student, a man named Epictetus, who absorbed and then amplified his teacher's insights, would go on to write words that a Roman emperor kept on his nightstand and that Navy SEAL instructors still distribute to candidates today. What did Musonius discover in chains that the free and powerful couldn't find in their palaces? He realized something so simple and so radical that it sounds almost naive until you live it. No one can take your mind from you unless you hand it to them. Your body can be owned. Your time can be controlled. Your movements can be restricted. Your possessions can be confiscated. Your relationships severed. Your name erased from every public record. But the one thing that no external force can touch, without your permission, is how you choose to interpret what is happening to you. This was the birth of what we now call Stoicism, not a philosophy of passivity or emotionless endurance, a philosophy of ferocious inner sovereignty. The Stoics, Musonius and Epictetus, but also Marcus Aurelius, the most powerful emperor Rome ever produced, and Seneca, one of the wealthiest and most politically turbulent figures of the ancient world, all arrived at the same core architecture of human resilience. There are two categories of things in life: things within your control and things outside it. Suffering comes from confusing the two. What falls within your control? Your thoughts, your judgments, your decisions, your responses, your values, the interpretation you give to events. What falls outside your control? Other people's behavior, the economy, the weather, the past, the future, death. Whether your flight is on time, whether someone you love chooses to stay, the moment you attempt to control what is beyond your control, you suffer. Not because the universe is punishing you, but because you have structurally guaranteed your own frustration. You've made your emotional peace contingent on variables you don't own. Marcus Aurelius understood this better than perhaps anyone who has ever lived. He commanded the greatest military force in the known world. He had more external power than any human being of his era. He could reroute rivers, command legions, and reshape the boundaries of civilization. And in his private journal, the collection we now call Meditations, he spent thousands of words reminding himself of one thing: none of that external power is where the real power lives. He wrote to himself, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wrote, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." He wrote again and again, as a man disciplining his own thinking. Choose not to be harmed, and you won't feel harmed. Don't feel harmed, and you haven't been. This was not poetry. This was a battlefield commander's operating manual for his own psyche. Here's what makes this relevant to your life in a way that goes beyond inspiration. The Stoics weren't born with exceptional emotional control. They trained it, like a muscle, deliberately, systematically, day after day. They developed specific mental exercises designed to make their minds less reactive, less dependent on external conditions, less vulnerable to the inevitable chaos that life generates. One of the most powerful of these practices they called premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of adversity. They would deliberately imagine losing the things they valued most: their reputation, their wealth, their loved ones, their health, their freedom, not to wallow in misery, not to attract bad luck, but to make the mind familiar with loss before loss arrived. What happens to a soldier who has practiced handling pressure before going into combat versus one who encounters it for the first time on the battlefield? The practiced soldier doesn't freeze. The practiced mind doesn't shatter. They also practiced what you might call perspective scaling, deliberately zooming out from their current problem to the largest possible frame. If this conflict feels enormous right now, how does it look from across the city? How does it look from across the country? From the perspective of a century? From the indifferent vastness of geological time? This wasn't nihilism. It wasn't a way of saying nothing matters. It was a method for preventing the mind from treating temporary setbacks as permanent catastrophes, for recognizing that the thing consuming your full emotional bandwidth right now will likely be invisible background noise in 5 years. Seneca, brilliant, politically dangerous, fabulously wealthy, and perpetually at risk of being destroyed by whichever emperor was currently in power, wrote this in a letter to a friend: "We suffer more in imagination than in reality." He watched people around him spiral into devastation over things that hadn't happened yet, over futures that never came, over scenarios constructed entirely in the mind and then experienced as if they were real. He also wrote, "It is not the man who has too little who is poor, but the man who craves more." not a statement about economics, a statement about the architecture of contentment and how the mind creates both scarcity and abundance from the same raw material. What does this mean for you? It means that the emotional suffering you've been experiencing, the anxiety, the resentment, the lingering hurt from things that happened years ago, the dread about things that might happen years from now, is not inevitable. It is not a fixed feature of your personality. It is not just how you are. It is a set of mental habits, habits that were installed by accident, without your conscious participation, during years when you didn't know you could opt out. And habits, every single habit that exists in your nervous system, can be changed. The only question is whether you're willing to do the work. The Stoics were. That's why, more than 2,000 years after their deaths, their ideas are being studied by psychologists at Stanford, practiced by special operations units in Fort Bragg, and built into therapeutic frameworks used in hospitals from Boston to Los Angeles. They weren't just philosophizing. They were engineering minds that could operate effectively under any condition. And the blueprint is still available. The construction project is still possible. In fact, it's exactly what the rest of this audiobook is about. What neuroscience found when it looked inside. Stoic wisdom. The brain science that proves the ancients were right. For a long time, the Stoics' central claim was dismissed by modern psychology. The idea that you could consciously choose your emotional responses, that you could think your way out of pain, struck many researchers as dangerously simplistic. Emotions, the argument went, are automatic. They're biological. They're not chosen. You can't willpower your way out of fear any more than you can willpower your way out of a broken arm. Then the brain imaging equipment got good enough to actually look inside a mind in the act of managing itself. And what the neuroscientists found stopped them cold. The Stoics hadn't been doing philosophy. They'd been doing neuroscience without a laboratory. Here's what we now know about how your brain processes emotional experience and why it matters enormously to everything you're learning in this audiobook. Your brain is not one unified thing. It's more accurately described as several systems operating simultaneously, sometimes in alignment and sometimes in direct conflict with each other. For our purposes, two of these systems are critical. The first is your limbic system, particularly a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala. The amygdala is ancient. It was doing its job millions of years before your species existed. Its function is to detect threats and trigger survival responses. Fast, powerful, often accurate, and completely incapable of nuance. The amygdala does not know the difference between a tiger and a passive-aggressive email from your boss. It does not distinguish between physical danger and social rejection. It scans for anything that resembles a threat, and when it finds one, or thinks it does, it floods your system with stress hormones and puts you on war footing. This all happens in approximately 40 milliseconds, before you've consciously processed a single word of that email, before you've decided how you feel about it, before you've even really noticed that you're reading it. The second system is your prefrontal cortex, the large structure directly behind your forehead. This is your thinking brain, the part that plans, reasons, considers multiple perspectives, and makes conscious decisions. It's slower than the amygdala. Processing takes roughly 500 milliseconds versus 40, but it's incomparably more sophisticated. And here is the discovery that validates 2,000 years of Stoic practice. The prefrontal cortex can override the amygdala's responses. You can think your way to a different emotional experience. The conscious mind has genuine regulatory authority over automatic emotional reactions. This is not wishful thinking. This is observable, measurable, reproducible neuroscience. Dr. Sarah Chien, a cognitive neuroscience researcher at the University of Chicago, has spent the last decade studying what happens in the brain during what she calls cognitive reappraisal, the practice of consciously changing how you interpret a situation in order to change how you feel about it. Her findings are unambiguous. People who practice reappraisal show measurably increased activity in the prefrontal cortex and measurably decreased activity in the amygdala. They are literally, physically altering their brain's response to stressful situations through the deliberate direction of thought. What is cognitive reappraisal? It's the prefrontal cortex doing what Epictetus was teaching in the 1st century AD. It's choosing your interpretation of events rather than accepting the amygdala's first instinctive reading of them. The neuroscience of rumination is equally instructive. Rumination is what happens when you replay negative experiences in your mind. When you mentally rehearse the argument, reread the message, relive the humiliation, re-examine the rejection. Most people do this constantly and call it processing. It isn't processing, it's re-traumatization. Dr. James Whitmore at Johns Hopkins has shown that rumination is one of the single strongest predictors of clinical depression and anxiety disorders. The mechanism is straightforward. When you ruminate, you're repeatedly triggering your amygdala. The stress hormone response never has a chance to subside because you keep reactivating it. The emotional wound never has a chance to close because you keep reopening it. What the Stoics practiced, observing thoughts without following them, returning to the present moment, refusing to catastrophize about the future or lament the past, is precisely what interrupts the rumination cycle. The Stoics knew this through introspection. Neuroscience has since confirmed it through MRI scans. Dr. Marcus Webb at Georgetown University discovered something even more remarkable. The brain is physically changeable by the habits you practice. Neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to reorganize and create new neural pathways throughout your lifetime, means that every time you practice choosing a rational response over an automatic emotional reaction, you are literally rewiring your neural architecture. People who consistently practice mindfulness, cognitive reappraisal, and present moment focus, all essentially Stoic practices, develop measurably larger prefrontal cortexes and measurably smaller, less reactive amygdalas. They don't just behave differently. Their brains become structurally different. You can build a different brain. The one you have right now is not the one you're stuck with. There's another piece of neuroscience that speaks directly to the core argument of this audiobook. Research from the field of cognitive appraisal theory, pioneered by psychologists Richard Lazarus and Susan Folkman in the 1980s and refined by dozens of researchers since, demonstrates that emotional responses are not triggered directly by events. They're triggered by your appraisal of those events. The mechanism works like this. Something happens. Before you consciously register an emotion, your brain has already performed a rapid evaluation. Is this threatening or not? Can I cope with it? What does this mean for my goals and well-being? The emotional response you experience is a function of these appraisals, not a direct response to the event itself, which means the event by itself carries no emotional charge. The charge is assigned by your appraisal system, and appraisals can be retrained. A pivotal study published in the Journal of Neuroscience examined individuals who had experienced significant personal loss, the kind of grief that stops a person's life. Half the group received standard supportive counseling. The other half received training in cognitive appraisal techniques, essentially Stoic-derived practices for consciously examining and redirecting interpretation of experiences. After 8 weeks, brain scans revealed structural differences between the two groups. The appraisal-trained group showed reduced amygdala reactivity, not just when thinking about their specific loss, but across all emotionally challenging scenarios they were presented. The Stoics called this building character. Neuroscientists call it developing resilient circuitry. The architecture is the same. There's one more neurological insight that might be the most practically important thing in this entire chapter. Dr. Emma Rodriguez at Stanford's psychology department has studied what she calls the 90-second window, the biological life cycle of an emotional response in the body when it is not reinforced by additional thought. Her research confirms that the physiological component of an emotional surge, the hormone release, the elevated heart rate, the muscle tension, the cascade of biological responses, naturally subsides within approximately 90 seconds if not re-triggered. 90 seconds. That's how long actual unaugmented emotional distress lasts in the body. After that, any continuation of that emotional state is you extending it, you feeding it, with memory, with narrative, with additional interpretation. You've experienced pain that lasted for months, for years, that still activates when you hear a certain song or see a certain person's name. None of that extended suffering was the original event's doing. The original event's biological contribution ran its course in a minute and a half. Everything after that was the story you kept telling. This is not a condemnation. It's a revelation. Because it means the duration and intensity of your suffering has always been within your power to affect, not eliminate. The 90 seconds is real and has to be felt. But after those 90 seconds, you have genuine agency over what happens next. The Stoics understood this intuitively. They didn't try to suppress emotional responses. They felt them. They acknowledged them. But they refused to feed them beyond their natural life cycle. They refused to build elaborate narrative structures around temporary physiological events and call those structures permanent truths. And now, you know exactly why that worked. The ancient warriors became emotionally bulletproof, not because they were made of different material than you, but because they understood and practiced daily what modern neuroscience has only recently proven with instruments sophisticated enough to see inside a living brain. Your emotions are not your master. They are your informants. They carry data. They don't carry commands. And the difference between those two things is the difference between spending your life at the mercy of events outside your control or spending it as the sovereign author of your own inner world. The half-second that changes everything. Finding the choice, point between what happens and what you feel, between what happens to you and how you respond to what happens to you. There is a gap. Most people live their entire lives without ever noticing it exists. In 1946, a psychiatrist named Viktor Frankl emerged from 4 years in Nazi concentration camps, including Auschwitz, carrying almost nothing. His entire family had been killed. His life's work had been destroyed. His body had been systematically degraded. By any external measure, the world had done its absolute worst to him. What he brought out of those camps was not bitterness, not numbness, not the shattered remnants of a person trying to reassemble into something functional. He brought out a manuscript, a system of thought. An insight so powerful that the book that contained it has since sold more than 16 million copies and been translated into 50 languages. The insight was this: between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom. Frankl had learned in the most extreme human laboratory imaginable that even when everything external is stripped away, freedom, safety, loved ones, physical dignity, the future itself, one thing remains: the ability to choose how you respond to your circumstances. the ability to stand in that gap between what happens and what it means, and make a conscious decision about which way to fall. He observed that among the prisoners in those camps, facing identical external conditions, some became bitter and some became generous. Some helped fellow prisoners despite having nothing. Some hoarded and betrayed despite having been victims themselves. The external conditions explained nothing. The internal response explained everything. The gap, the space between stimulus and response, was the only territory where human freedom lived, and it was inviolable. No guard, no system, no regime of suffering could enter it without permission. Here's how the gap works in your everyday life, and why most people don't know it's there. When something happens to you, your brain processes it in layers. The fastest layer is the amygdala's automatic threat detection system. Remember, that's 40 milliseconds. Before you're consciously aware of what you experienced, your brain has already generated an interpretation and a corresponding emotional response. This all happens so fast that the stimulus and the emotional response seem fused. Someone says something cutting and you feel hurt. A plan falls apart and you feel anxious. A driver cuts you off and you feel angry. The event and the emotion appear to be the same thing. Cause and effect with no space in between. But they're not the same thing. The space is real. The interpretation step, where your brain decided what the event meant, happened between the event and the emotion. You just didn't see it because it happened below the threshold of conscious awareness. This is the core problem of reactive emotional living. The interpretation happens. It generates the emotion, and then you experience the emotion as if it were a direct response to reality, rather than a response to your unconscious reading of reality. The goal of what the Stoics practiced, and what we now understand neurologically, is to slow this process down enough to insert conscious choice at the interpretation step. Let's make this tangible. Your manager sends you an email after hours that says only, "Can we talk tomorrow morning?" Your automatic interpretation system fires immediately. Depending on your history, your current stress level, your relationship with this particular manager, your brain might instantly generate, "I'm being fired. I made a mistake. They're disappointed in me. Something is wrong." Each of these interpretations generates a corresponding emotional state. The emotional state feels like a direct response to the email, but the email said nothing about any of those things. The email said 5 words. Your brain supplied an entire narrative. Now here's the practice. Noticing the interpretation layer. Instead of fusing immediately with the emotion, inserting a conscious pause that asks, what interpretation am I making here? Is this interpretation based on facts, or is it based on fear? Facts. Your manager wants to speak tomorrow morning. Fear-based interpretation. Something catastrophic is happening. These are not the same thing. And once you can see them as separate, you have the ability to ask, what is a more accurate, more useful way to interpret this situation? Maybe the meeting is about a new project. Maybe they want to give feedback, which might be positive. Maybe they thought of something and simply want to catch you before the day gets busy. All of these are equally supported by the available evidence, which is 5 words in an after-hours email. This is not toxic positivity. This is not forcing yourself to believe everything is fine. This is applying accurate thinking to a situation that your automatic system has already distorted with catastrophizing. The practice of finding the choice point has 3 stages. The first stage is awareness, learning to notice when an automatic interpretation has fired. The signal is any strong emotional reaction: anger, anxiety, hurt, shame, dread. Any of these is a flag that your amygdala has made a call and your conscious mind hasn't reviewed it yet. When you notice the emotional signal, instead of running with the emotion, pause and ask, what interpretation just fired? The second stage is examination, questioning the automatic interpretation. Is this thought actually true? What evidence supports it? What evidence contradicts it? What other explanations exist? If your most trusted friend was having this thought, what would you tell them? This isn't about dismissing your reactions. It's about auditing them for accuracy before committing to them. The third stage is choice, consciously selecting the interpretation that is most accurate, most aligned with available evidence, and most useful for moving forward. Not the most optimistic, not the most comfortable, the most honest and the most functionally helpful. This process sounds slow. It isn't. Once it becomes habitual, athletes learn to make complex technical adjustments in milliseconds after sufficient practice. You can learn to audit interpretations in the same way, developing the ability to catch automatic readings before they generate unnecessary suffering, not by slowing down time, but by building reflexes that operate within it. Advanced practitioners of this skill describe something that sounds almost paradoxical. They still experience the full spectrum of human emotion. They still feel the hit of bad news. They still feel the pull of anxiety before difficult conversations. They still feel grief when something genuinely worth grieving is lost. But the relationship between those feelings and their behavior changes fundamentally. They stop being run by their feelings. They become informed by them instead. Emotions contain data. Fear is data about perceived threat. Anger is data about perceived violation of something you value. Grief is data about genuine loss. Anxiety is data about uncertainty you haven't yet resolved. All of this information is useful. None of it requires you to simply comply with whatever behavior it's recommending. The gap between stimulus and response is where you get to evaluate whether what your emotion is recommending is actually what the situation calls for. It's where you get to decide whether the fear is pointing at something real or just activating old patterns. Whether the anger is calling for action or simply releasing pressure. Whether the anxiety deserves investigation or just requires acknowledgement before being set aside. Viktor Frankl found this gap in a concentration camp. You have access to it in traffic, in meetings, in difficult conversations, in the silent hours when old wounds send up flares. The question is whether you'll choose to use it. The alchemy of adversity. How to turn any experience into strength. The medieval alchemists spent generations trying to transform lead into gold. They failed. What they produced instead, unknowingly, were the foundations of modern chemistry. They learned what transformation requires, even as they chased the wrong transformation. You have access to an alchemy that actually works, the ability to take your hardest experiences, the losses, the failures, the betrayals, the humiliations, the moments that almost broke you, and consciously extract from them something that makes you permanently more capable. This isn't a metaphor. This is a documented psychological process called post-traumatic growth, and it is one of the most underreported phenomena in all of modern mental health research. Dr. Thomas Reeves at Northwestern University has spent 2 decades studying individuals who have faced what he calls life-disrupting adversity. Diagnoses, divorces, bankruptcies, bereavements, and traumas of a severity that most people would describe as life-ruining. His consistent finding: a significant portion of these individuals don't merely recover to their previous baseline, they surpass it. They become, by their own assessment and by measurable psychological metrics, stronger, clearer, more compassionate, and more purposeful than they were before the adversity occurred. This is not a story about silver linings or making the best of bad situations. Post-traumatic growth is a structural change in how a person processes reality. It happens when adversity is engaged with rather than endured, when someone, consciously or through temperament, treats their hardest experience as a teacher rather than an assailant. But here's the critical caveat. This growth is not automatic. Simply being hurt doesn't make you stronger. Being hurt and then consciously choosing how to interpret and integrate that experience, that's what produces growth. The difference is the engagement of the prefrontal cortex, the conscious meaning-making layer, between the event and the learning. This is what emotional alchemy means. The deliberate extraction of maximum value from any experience, including especially the difficult ones. There are 5 principles to this practice. The first is what you might call training frame reappraisal. This means shifting your fundamental question about adversity from, "Why is this happening to me?" to, "What is this developing in me?" Not as a spiritual claim that everything happens for a reason. As a practical decision about which question leads to more useful answers. "Why is this happening to me?" is a question designed to locate a cause. It tends to land on answers like, "Because life is unfair," "Because I'm unlucky," "Because I made mistakes," "Because people let me down." These answers may be accurate. They generate very little forward motion. "What is this developing in me?" is a question designed to identify growth. It tends to produce answers like patience, perspective, the capacity to endure discomfort, clarity about what actually matters, understanding of what I'm made of. These answers may be harder to find. They generate considerably more forward motion. The second principle is deliberate meaning construction. Every experience exists as raw data until you assign it meaning. That assignment is always your work. Always, even when it doesn't feel like it. 2 people can emerge from identical hardships with completely different meanings attached to what happened. And those different meanings will produce entirely different futures. Consider 2 men who both build companies that fail. Man, one interprets the failure as evidence. "I'm not suited for this. I should have known better. I wasted years on something that couldn't work." His meaning is fixed, backward-facing, and defines him. Man 2 interprets the failure as training. "I know exactly what I'd do differently now. I learned things about myself and about business that no classroom would have taught me. I'm more prepared for the next attempt than anyone who hasn't been through this." His meaning is active, forward-facing, and develops him. The external events are identical. The meanings diverge sharply, and the meanings will shape every subsequent decision both men make. The third principle is temporal perspective. Acute pain has a particular psychological signature. It feels permanent. When you're inside intense suffering, your brain generates a powerful distortion. This will never end. This is your new normal. This is who you are now. None of this is true. Every emotional state is temporary. This is not denial. This is the most reliably confirmed finding in all of effective psychology. Moods change. Even grief, which has a genuine long-arc timeline, changes its character. Even the most devastating losses become integrated rather than obliterating over time. When you're in acute pain, consciously invoking the temporal perspective, reminding yourself that this state will not last forever, even when it seems like it will, interrupts the catastrophizing loop that amplifies temporary suffering into a permanent identity. The fourth principle is strength inventory. Adversity develops capacities that comfort cannot. Patience, tolerance for ambiguity, empathy born from having been genuinely hurt, confidence born from having survived something you weren't sure you could. creative problem solving developed under constraints, the ability to prioritize ruthlessly because you've been forced to. Most people who navigate serious hardship develop extraordinary abilities in the process, and then fail to recognize them because they're too focused on what the hardship cost them. Making a practice of cataloging what difficult experiences have built, not to perform gratitude, but to accurately account for your actual resources, changes your relationship with your own history. Your hard past is not just a list of things that happened to you. It's a set of capabilities that most people who haven't faced your challenges simply don't have. The fifth principle is purposeful transmission. Some of the most powerful transformations of pain into strength happen when your experience is used to help someone else navigate similar terrain. This doesn't require becoming a public figure or writing a memoir. It might be as simple as a conversation, a willingness to be honest with someone who's facing what you've survived. When you use your hardship to help another person, several things happen simultaneously. You create meaning that was not inherent in the original event. You reinforce your own growth by articulating what you've learned, and you build connections that make your experience feel woven into something larger than the raw pain it once was. None of these 5 principles ask you to pretend the adversity wasn't real. None of them ask you to be grateful for suffering. What they ask, what emotional alchemy always requires, is your conscious participation in the process of extracting value from what life has already presented you. The alchemists were looking for the wrong gold. The transformation that actually changes lives happens not in a laboratory furnace, but in the relationship between a mind and its hardest experiences. That laboratory is accessible to you right now. The 4 pillars building, a foundation that nothing can knock down. You've been building your emotional life on sand, not because you're weak, not because you lack discipline or intention, but because nobody ever showed you where the bedrock was. The 4 pillars you're about to learn are the structural foundation of unshakable emotional well-being. They don't work individually. They work as a system, each one supporting the others, creating together a quality of inner stability that, once built, becomes the default condition of your daily experience rather than something you have to fight to access. Master these 4, and external circumstances lose the power to determine your inner state, not occasionally, consistently. The first pillar, radical acceptance of what is. Radical acceptance is not resignation. It is not surrendering your ambitions or tolerating mistreatment, or deciding that nothing is worth fighting for. It is the precise recognition that reality is the only productive starting point for action. Every moment you spend arguing with what has already happened is a moment not available for responding to it. Every unit of mental energy you invest in wishing circumstances were different is energy not available for navigating circumstances as they are. Think about how much of your suffering is not about your current situation, but about your refusal to accept your current situation. The painful relationship isn't just painful, it's painful, plus the ongoing anguish of believing it should be different, that you shouldn't have to deal with this, that this isn't fair, that this isn't how it was supposed to go. Strip out the resistance, the shouldn't have to, the not fair, the this isn't right, and what remains is the actual situation, which may be genuinely difficult, but is no longer generating a second layer of suffering on top of itself. Radical acceptance means arriving at the fact of a situation without the editorial. Not, this is happening, and it's terrible and it's wrong, and I can't believe I have to deal with this. Just, this is happening. Full stop. From that clean starting point, you can ask, what does this situation call for? What is the most useful response available to me right now? You cannot navigate from anywhere except where you are. Acceptance establishes where you are. Everything useful follows from that. The second pillar, detachment from outcomes. You can want things fiercely. You can work toward them with everything you have. And you can remain, simultaneously, genuinely at peace regardless of whether you achieve them. This sounds contradictory. It isn't. The contradiction dissolves the moment you understand the difference between caring and attachment. Caring is the active orientation of your energy towards something that matters to you. It drives action. It focuses attention. It is entirely positive and fully compatible with inner peace. Attachment is the belief that your emotional stability depends on a specific outcome occurring. It creates anxiety before the outcome because the outcome is uncertain. It creates devastation when the outcome goes wrong because you've structured your sense of safety around it. It creates, paradoxically, less effective action because actions driven by desperate need are typically more anxious, more rigid, and more counterproductive than actions driven by genuine care. The highest performers in every competitive domain share this quality. They care enormously about winning and remain psychologically stable when they lose, not because they don't care about winning, because they've found their satisfaction in the execution, the preparation, the effort, the expression of their full capacity, rather than in the external verdict. This makes them more formidable competitors, not less, because their psychology isn't hostage to outcomes they don't fully control. Your emotional peace is not a hostage that external outcomes can hold. Practice releasing it from captivity. The third pillar, emotional self-sufficiency. Most people have accidentally made their emotional state contingent on other people's behavior. Their mood depends on how they're treated. Their confidence fluctuates with external validation. Their peace requires other people's approval, kindness, or recognition to exist. This creates a permanent structural vulnerability because other people's behavior is never fully within your control. And people, being complex, flawed, self-interested, and distracted, will inevitably behave in ways that disappoint, confuse, frustrate, or hurt you. If your emotional state requires the world to consistently cooperate, your emotional state is perpetually at risk. Emotional self-sufficiency means generating your own validation, your own recognition of your worth, your own sense of groundedness from within, rather than waiting for it to be supplied from without. This doesn't mean you stop caring whether people treat you well. It means that if they don't, the wound isn't existential. It's information. It's a signal. It may call for a boundary, a conversation, or a change, but it does not collapse your sense of who you are. The fourth pillar, present moment grounding. Almost all unnecessary suffering, the kind that isn't about what's happening right now, but about what happened before, or what might happen next, exists in time zones that aren't the present. You can't change the past. You can learn from it, and you should. But mental rehearsal of old pain beyond what's needed for learning is not processing. It's self-harm in slow motion. The future is genuinely uncertain. You can plan for it, and you should. But catastrophic projection of future scenarios that may never occur is not preparation. It's spending emotional resources on experiences you may never actually have. The present is the only place where life is actually happening. And the present, most of the time for most people in ordinary circumstances, is manageable. It's the accumulation of the past and the projection of the future onto the present moment that makes it feel overwhelming. When you train yourself to return again and again to what is actually happening right now, you discover that right now is almost always navigable. The mountain is manageable when you're climbing the step in front of you. It's only when you try to climb every future step simultaneously that you freeze. These four pillars work together. Acceptance keeps you present by ending your argument with reality. Detachment reduces anxiety about future outcomes. Emotional self-sufficiency prevents old relationship wounds from contaminating your current experience. Present moment grounding supports all three by anchoring you in what's actually real rather than in mental projections. Build these pillars through daily practice. Each difficult situation in your life is a construction opportunity. Every time you choose acceptance over resistance, detachment over desperate grasping, self-generated stability over approval-seeking, presence over mental time travel, you lay another course of bricks. The storms don't stop. The foundation becomes unshakable. The observer effect, learning to watch your mind without being controlled by it. You are not your thoughts. This statement is either immediately obvious or profoundly disorienting, depending on where you currently are in your relationship with your own mind. If it's obvious, good. Stay with it, because the implications go much deeper than the words suggest. If it's disorienting, that's actually better, because it means you're encountering something genuinely new. Here's the practical reality. Your thoughts are events that occur in your mind. They arise based on past conditioning, current stress levels, neurological patterns formed over decades of experience, and often for reasons that have nothing to do with what's actually happening around you right now. They appear. They generate emotional charge. They disappear and are replaced by other thoughts. Your capacity to observe this process, to watch your thoughts arise and pass without automatically believing them, following them, or being run by them, is one of the most transformative cognitive skills in existence. Psychologists call it metacognition. The Stoics called it the examined life. Every major contemplative tradition on earth, from Zen Buddhism to Sufi mysticism to indigenous American healing practices, identified this same capacity as the gateway to genuine inner freedom. And yet, almost no one is ever taught how to develop it. Most people live in a condition psychologists call cognitive fusion, complete identification with their mental activity. A thought appears and they immediately become it. Not, I'm noticing a thought that suggests I'm failing. Just, I'm failing. Not, there's a fear that this relationship is ending. Just, this relationship is ending and I'm terrified. The thought and the thinker merge instantly. The observation and the observer are the same. This fusion is the mechanism by which temporary mental events, which have the natural lifespan of clouds, become apparently permanent features of reality. I'm a failure doesn't feel like a thought. It feels like a fact. This will never get better doesn't feel like an interpretation. It feels like an accurate prediction of the future. But it isn't. It's a thought, and thoughts can be observed rather than inhabited. Here's how to begin developing the observer perspective. The entry point is noticing the difference between having an experience and narrating an experience. Right now, as you listen to these words, there is a version of you that is receiving the content. And there's another capacity, present simultaneously, that is watching you receive the content, noticing your reactions to it, observing whether you're engaged or skeptical, focused or distracted, moved or unmoved. That second capacity, the one that can watch you think, is the observer. It doesn't argue with your thoughts. It doesn't judge them. It doesn't try to force them to be different. It simply notices. This is what the mind is doing right now. Start practicing this with low-stakes mental activity. During an ordinary moment, driving, eating, exercising, turn a fraction of your attention toward what your mind is doing. What thoughts are passing through? What stories is it generating? What emotional tone is it operating in? Don't evaluate what you find. Don't celebrate it or criticize it. Just notice it. The practice is the noticing itself. As you develop this habit, extend it to more charged territory. When you're anxious, instead of being your anxiety, try, I'm noticing anxiety arising right now. When you're angry, instead of being your anger, try. There's a significant anger response happening here. When you're convinced that something is catastrophic, try, my mind is presenting this as catastrophic. Let me examine that claim. These linguistic shifts feel subtle. Their effects are not subtle. The act of placing language between yourself and your emotional state creates the same functional separation as the choice point we discussed in Chapter 4, except at the level of identification rather than just interpretation. You're not just choosing a different response. You're maintaining the distinction between the observer and the observed, which prevents you from being swallowed entirely by any particular mental state. Marcus Aurelius did this in his private journal, writing in the second person, you and Marcus, rather than I, as a way of maintaining observer distance from his own mental activity. When he wrote, you are not your suffering, Marcus. You are the one experiencing it. He wasn't just philosophizing. He was practicing the cognitive separation that allowed him to function with extraordinary clarity under conditions that would paralyze most people. There are several specific cognitive distancing techniques that have proven consistently powerful across cultures and contexts. Temporal distancing asks, how will I see this in 5 years? In 20? This question doesn't minimize current pain. It accurately contextualizes it. The thing that feels enormously significant right now, that seems like it's defining who you are and what your life means, has a relationship with the future that your current perspective can't accurately assess. 5 years from now, you'll understand things about this experience that you can't possibly know yet. Invoking that future perspective creates psychological space in the present. Perspective taking asks, what would someone I deeply respect think about how I'm approaching this? What would someone who has been through something much harder see when they look at my situation? What advice would I give a friend facing exactly what I'm facing right now? Each of these questions activates a viewpoint that exists outside your current reactive state, and each of them tends to generate significantly more accurate and useful thinking than the automatic perspective you're in. Thought labeling, developed in mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, is the simple practice of naming your mental activity as it arises. Not, I'm a failure. There's a self-critical thought. Not, this is a disaster. There's a catastrophizing thought. Not, no one cares about me. There's a thought about isolation. The label creates distance. The distance creates choice. And then there's the practice that the ancient philosopher Zhuangzi described through a deceptively simple story, the butterfly dream. He dreamed he was a butterfly, flying freely with no knowledge that he was Zhuangzi. When he woke, he couldn't be certain. Was he Zhuangzi who had dreamed of being a butterfly? Or was he a butterfly dreaming of being Zhuangzi? The point wasn't confusion. The point was perspective. What you take to be the stable, fixed you is itself a construct of mind, and constructs can be held more lightly than you've been holding them. You are not your worst thoughts about yourself. You are the one noticing those thoughts. You are not your most frightening fears about the future. You are the one aware of those fears. You are not your sharpest memories of past pain. You are the consciousness in which those memories arise. This distinction is not abstract. It is the difference between being imprisoned by your mind and being liberated by it. The story you're living in, how to become the author rather than the character. Every human being on earth is living inside a story, a narrative about who they are, what kind of person they've turned out to be. why the things that happened to them happened, what they're capable of, and what they can reasonably expect from their future. Most people didn't write this story. It was written for them, assembled from the conclusions drawn by a child trying to make sense of complex adult situations, from feedback absorbed before the capacity to evaluate it existed, from patterns recognized before the context for that recognition was mature enough to be trustworthy. And it runs in the background of every experience you have, every decision you make, every relationship you form, every risk you assess, without ever announcing itself or asking for your review. The story might be saying, I'm the kind of person who doesn't get to have what I want. It might be saying, relationships always end badly for me. It might be saying, I'm intelligent but unlucky, or hardworking but doomed to be overlooked, or loving but always with people who can't appreciate it. It might be more subtle than any of these, a pervasive background tone rather than a specific statement. Whatever form it takes, your current inner narrative is determining far more of your experience than any external circumstance. It's selecting which data points you pay attention to and which you filter out. It's generating the predictions your nervous system uses to prepare for what's coming. It's creating the self-fulfilling loops that make your beliefs about yourself appear to be simply accurate observations of reality. But here is the crucial truth. No narrative about a human life is objectively correct. Life is complex enough that evidence can be found for almost any story you want to tell about it. The exact same sequence of events can support the narrative, I am someone who keeps failing, or I am someone who keeps trying despite setbacks. Both use identical evidence. One produces learned helplessness. The other produces resilience. You are not stuck with the narrative you were handed. The process of becoming a conscious author of your own story has 4 phases. The first phase is identification, actually surfacing the narrative that's currently operating. This requires honesty and some excavation, because the story runs so automatically that it's practically invisible. Pay attention to the assumptions you make when facing challenges. Notice the explanations you reach for when things go wrong. Listen to the language you use when describing your life and history to other people, especially to people you've just met, who have no context and who you're briefing on who you are. The story you tell them about yourself is, in compressed form, your current inner narrative. Common themes to watch for. Narratives centered on victimhood. Things happen to me rather than I engage with things. Narratives centered on unworthiness. I don't deserve good things. Good things are for other people. Narratives centered on inevitability. This is just how it is. It won't change. I've tried before. These are not the only limiting narratives, but they're among the most common and the most impactful. The second phase is evaluation, honestly assessing whether your current narrative is serving you, not whether it feels true, whether it is useful, whether it is empowering you toward the life you want to live, or whether it is actively working against you. The third phase is reauthoring, consciously choosing a different narrative framework, not by denying what has happened to you, not by forcing artificial positivity onto real pain, but by deliberately selecting the interpretation of your history that is both honest and development-oriented. A powerful framework for this is what the mythologist Joseph Campbell described as the hero's journey, the universal story structure in which a protagonist is called into difficulty, faces challenges that seem designed to defeat them, develops new capabilities through the encounter with adversity, and emerges fundamentally transformed. This structure is found in every storytelling tradition on Earth because it maps accurately onto how genuine human growth works. When you reframe your own life story as a hero's narrative rather than a victim narrative, you don't change what happened. You change what it means, and consequently what it prepares you for. Your failures become plot development. Your setbacks become the points in the story where the character's real capacities are revealed. Your pain becomes evidence, not that you're broken, but that the journey is real and the stakes are genuine. The fourth phase is maintenance, understanding that your inner narrative will always be subject to drift, especially under pressure. When you're tired, stressed, or hurt, the old narrative tends to reassert itself. This is not failure. It's how minds work. The practice is continuing to notice when you've slipped back into the old story and choosing the new one again. One specific technique for narrative maintenance. Pay close attention to how you explain setbacks to yourself. Psychologist Martin Seligman identified 3 dimensions that distinguish resilient self-explanations from helpless ones. Resilient explanations treat setbacks as temporary rather than permanent, as specific rather than global, and as situational rather than personal. That approach didn't work in this case, rather than, I always fail. This relationship had problems rather than, I'm unlovable. I made a mistake in this decision rather than, I have terrible judgment. These are not denials of what went wrong. They're accurate framing, because setbacks actually are usually specific, situational, and temporary. The story that makes them permanent, global, and personal is the distortion that resilient explanation corrects. The stories you tell about the future matter as much as the ones you tell about the past. Your expectations, the narrative you project onto what's coming, shape what you notice, what you attempt, and what you interpret as evidence of progress or failure. Develop forward-looking narratives that are honest about difficulty while remaining open about possibility. Not, things will definitely work out. Not every story ends well, and pretending otherwise is not resilience. But I have navigated hard things before, and I will be able to navigate whatever comes. That story is both accurate and immensely more useful than its opposite. You are not a character reading from a script you didn't write. You are an author with full revision rights. The question is when you're going to pick up the pen. The shield of strategic detachment. How to care deeply without bleeding. Every time there is a quality that the most emotionally stable people you've ever met all share. And it's often misidentified as coldness or indifference or an emotional limitation. A thing they've learned not to feel. That's the wrong diagnosis. What they've actually learned is something far more sophisticated. They've learned how to care about things without being owned by them. Strategic emotional detachment, the ability to remain centered in yourself regardless of what other people do or what circumstances arise, is not the absence of caring. It's the achievement of a form of caring that doesn't require specific outcomes in order to be expressed. It's love that doesn't need to be returned in exactly the right way to remain love. It's ambition that doesn't need to succeed in order to remain purposeful. It's engagement with life that doesn't need every variable to cooperate in order to remain fully alive. The source of most interpersonal suffering is not other people's behavior. It's your emotional attachment to other people's behavior being a certain way. Consider, what if the person whose approval you've been seeking doesn't give it? What if the relationship you've invested in doesn't develop the way you hoped? What if the recognition you've worked toward doesn't materialize? What if the people you love make choices you can see will hurt them, and there's nothing you can do to stop it? If your inner stability depends on these things resolving in specific ways, then your inner stability is permanently at risk, because none of these things are fully within your control. But here's what is always within your control: how you show up, what you offer, the quality of attention and care and commitment you bring to your relationships and your work, regardless of what comes back, the integrity of your actions, independent of whether those actions are recognized or reciprocated. When you shift your focus from the outcome you're trying to get to the quality of person you're choosing to be, something remarkable happens. Your emotional stability stops requiring external cooperation. Your peace is no longer held hostage by variables you don't own. This is not resignation. Strategically detached people are not passive. They are often the most committed, most generous, most fully engaged people in any room, precisely because their engagement isn't motivated by the anxious calculation of what they'll get back. They give because giving is aligned with their values, not because they're keeping score and expecting returns. The distinction between caring and attachment becomes vivid in close relationships. You can love your children fiercely and simultaneously release attachment to the idea that they must live exactly the life you choose for them. You can care deeply about a friendship and simultaneously accept that the other person has their own path that won't always include you. You can be fully committed in a romantic relationship and simultaneously release the demand that your partner express their love in precisely the way you'd prefer. Paradoxically, this kind of detached love that isn't desperately grasping, is considerably more attractive, more sustainable, and more nourishing for both people than the attached version. People feel safer with someone who loves them freely than with someone who loves them as a project that needs to turn out correctly. One of the most corrosive forms of emotional attachment in modern American life is the attachment to social approval. The chronic concern about what other people think about your choices, your appearance, your beliefs, your success, is a form of dependency that most people never name directly, even though it shapes an enormous portion of their daily decisions. The Stoics had a specific term for things outside your control that you're treating as if they were inside it. They called these indifference. Not things that are unimportant. Your reputation matters, your relationships matter, your success matters. But indifference in the philosophical sense, things that don't determine your character, your virtue, or your inner freedom. Things that are not you. Someone's opinion of you is an indifferent. It contains information, sometimes accurate, sometimes not, but it is not you. It does not determine your worth, and it is not a reliable guide to your choices. People's opinions about you are a function of their own histories, preferences, biases, and current emotional states. They're largely not about you at all. The practice of developing detachment from social approval doesn't mean ignoring useful feedback. It means evaluating feedback on its merits rather than simply absorbing it as a verdict. It means asking, is this assessment accurate? Is it useful? What can I learn from it? Rather than, this person disapproves of me and therefore I must be wrong, or must defend myself, or must adjust to recapture their approval. Strategic detachment is a practice that requires daily maintenance. The mind naturally generates attachment to outcomes, to approval, to specific behaviors from specific people. That's not a flaw. It's the relational mammalian brain doing what it evolved to do. The practice is not to eliminate these attachments, but to hold them lightly enough that when they're not fulfilled, you don't collapse. The Stoics practiced a specific meditation for this. They would mentally rehearse the scenario in which what they were attached to was lost or failed to materialize, not to eliminate desire, but to maintain the capacity to function regardless of outcome. The rehearsal created genuine psychological preparation. You can do this for the outcomes you're most anxious about, for the approvals you most need, for the behaviors from others you're most dependent on. Imagine fully and honestly those things not materializing. And then ask yourself, who would I be in that scenario? What would I do? What would remain? What remains is you. The you that exists independent of external validation, specific outcomes, and particular behavior from particular people. That version of you is always available. Strategic detachment is simply the practice of accessing it consistently, rather than only when everything else has been stripped away. Becoming anti-fragile. Advanced techniques for a mind that grows stronger under pressure. There's a word that philosopher Nassim Nicholas Taleb introduced to describe a category of systems that most people never knew existed. The word is anti-fragile, and it describes something fundamentally different from resilience. Resilient things resist pressure and return to their original state. Flexible things bend and spring back. Anti-fragile things don't just survive stress, they improve because of it. They require volatility to reach their full potential. Without adversity, they don't become stronger. They atrophy. Your mind is capable of being anti-fragile. Most people's minds operate far below this capacity because the culture around them, which values comfort, predictability, and the absence of difficulty, has inadvertently trained them toward fragility. The goal of avoiding stress, avoiding discomfort, avoiding challenges that carry genuine risk of failure, produces minds that break when stress arrives. And stress always arrives. The anti-fragile mind doesn't just tolerate adversity. It requires it to grow. It seeks it deliberately in controlled doses so that when adversity comes, uninvited and uncontrolled, the mind isn't encountering it for the first time. There are 3 advanced capabilities that together constitute genuine mental anti-fragility. The first advanced capability, voluntary discomfort. The Stoic philosopher Seneca practiced what he called voluntary poverty, periodically choosing to live without luxuries, eating simple food, wearing rough clothing, experiencing mild physical hardship, not as punishment, as training. He wanted to prove to himself regularly that his comfort was not his master, that if luxury was stripped away, he would still be himself, that his identity and his equanimity were not contingent on comfortable circumstances. He wrote, "Set aside a certain number of days during which you shall be content with the scantiest and cheapest fare, with coarse and rough dress, saying to yourself the while, 'Is this the condition that I feared?'" This practice is as relevant to modern life as it was in first-century Rome. Probably more relevant in a culture that has eliminated most involuntary discomfort and replaced it with an extraordinary abundance of convenience. The problem with extraordinary convenience is that it makes the mind progressively less capable of tolerating inconvenience. When everything works smoothly, the first friction becomes catastrophic. The delayed flight, the slow service, the technological failure, the plan that doesn't materialize. These become disproportionately disturbing precisely because so much has been optimized to prevent them. Voluntary discomfort is the practice of regularly, deliberately choosing experiences that are uncomfortable in controlled and appropriate ways. This builds the capacity to tolerate involuntary discomfort when it inevitably arrives. It also develops a specific kind of confidence, not the borrowed confidence of a good track record or external validation, but the earned confidence of having proven to yourself that you can function effectively under conditions that are not optimal. In physical terms, this might mean regular, demanding exercise that extends beyond comfort, cold exposure, fasting, any practice that requires the body to function outside its preferred range. The psychological gains from these physical practices are as significant as the physical ones, perhaps more so. In emotional terms, it means regularly practicing the difficult conversations, the honest feedback, the situations where disapproval or conflict is possible. Not manufacturing unnecessary conflict, but not indefinitely avoiding the challenging interactions that growth and integrity require. The second advanced capability Emotional granularity. Research by psychologist Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern University has consistently demonstrated that people with larger emotional vocabularies, greater ability to distinguish between similar but distinct emotional states, are significantly more psychologically resilient and better at regulating their emotional responses. Most people experience their emotional life in broad, coarse categories: good or bad, stressed or relaxed, happy or sad. These large buckets contain enormous variation that never gets examined because the vocabulary for examining it doesn't exist. The difference between feeling overwhelmed and feeling challenged is enormous. But most people lump both into stressed. The difference between feeling genuinely sad and feeling merely tired is significant. But without the vocabulary for it, both generate the same uninformative signal. The difference between feeling angry and feeling embarrassed often matters more than the anger or embarrassment themselves. But without the distinction, they're the same mess. Developing emotional granularity means expanding your emotional vocabulary and actually using it in the act of observing your inner states. Not just "I feel bad," but "Am I feeling disappointed, frustrated, anxious, humiliated, betrayed?" Each of these is a distinct emotional experience with a distinct cause structure, a distinct natural duration, and a distinct appropriate response. Accurately naming what you're actually experiencing accomplishes two things. First, it engages your prefrontal cortex. The naming process itself is a cognitive act that activates the rational brain and reduces amygdala reactivity. Second, it gives you precise information about what the emotion is actually about and what it's calling for. Rather than the blunt instruction, "Feel bad about something," start by expanding your emotional vocabulary consciously. When you notice an emotional state arising, take a moment, just a moment, to find the most accurate name for it. Resist the coarse categories. Get specific. "I'm frustrated that this isn't working the way I thought it would" is considerably more actionable than "I feel bad." "I'm anxious about the uncertainty in this situation" points directly at what the anxiety needs, either more information or more tolerance of the inherent uncertainty. "I feel bad" points at nothing. The third advanced capability: rapid recovery. The distinction between resilient people and fragile people is not that resilient people experience fewer difficult emotions or less intense ones. The distinction is in recovery time. Resilient people return to psychological baseline faster after setbacks. Recovery speed is trainable. It depends primarily on three things: avoiding rumination, maintaining physical practices that regulate the nervous system, and maintaining the habit of perspective. Avoiding rumination means making a practice, a genuine, effortful practice, of processing experiences without replaying them. Experience something difficult. Extract the lessons. What actually happened here? What can I learn? What will I do differently? And then deliberately redirect attention to present engagement rather than continuing to circle the event. The key distinction is between processing and ruminating. Processing has a direction. It moves from the event toward insight and then toward present action. Ruminating is circular. It moves from the event back to the event, from the pain back to the pain, generating no new insight but continuously reactivating the stress response. One powerful tool for preventing rumination is journaling with a specific structure. Describe what happened factually. Identify what you feel and why. Extract 1 to 3 specific lessons. Identify the next concrete action available to you. Write it. Close the notebook. The act of writing creates a kind of cognitive resolution. The mind treats written material as processed in a way it doesn't treat material that only circulates in thought. Once it's on paper, the need to keep thinking about it reduces. Physical regulation practices, exercise, sleep, nutrition, are not peripheral to emotional resilience. They are structural. The prefrontal cortex, which is your primary tool for managing emotional responses, is among the first things to degrade under conditions of physical depletion. Decisions made when severely sleep-deprived show measurably reduced rational quality. Emotional reactivity spikes significantly when the body is in poor condition. You cannot build or maintain a stoic mind in a neglected body. Maintaining perspective is a practice of returning regularly to the temporal and contextual frames that the previous chapter described, not as a one-time insight but as a recurring habit. The question, how significant will this be in 5 years, needs to be asked not once, but every time the distorted urgency of immediate difficulty tries to establish itself as the complete truth. Anti-fragility is the destination these three capabilities point toward. Not just surviving your life's hardest experiences, using them as the raw material for becoming more capable, more grounded, and more genuinely useful to others than you could have become any other way. Wanting without chains. How to love and desire without fear. The deepest suffering in human relationships doesn't come from loving too much. It comes from the particular shape that love takes when it's entangled with fear. Love entangled with fear of loss becomes controlling. Love entangled with fear of unworthiness becomes anxious and demanding. Love entangled with fear of abandonment becomes possessive. Love entangled with the desperate need for validation becomes exhausting. For the person giving it and for the person receiving it. The ancient Stoics had precise language for this distinction. They separated preferences from demands. A preference is an orientation toward something you would like to have. A demand is a claim that you cannot be okay without it. Preferences create desire and motivation. Demands create anxiety, desperation, and the kind of grasping that tends to push away the very things it's trying to hold. Here's the paradox at the heart of this principle. The things most worth wanting are most available to people who have learned not to need them. This isn't a cosmic law or a guarantee. It's a description of how human psychology actually works in practice. Consider what it feels like to be around someone who desperately needs your approval versus someone who values your relationship but doesn't require it to feel okay. The first creates a subtle pressure, an unspoken demand that you perform in particular ways to maintain their emotional stability. The second creates freedom. You can be honest with them, imperfect, challenging, even difficult, and they remain present and grounded. Which relationship do you want? Which presence do you want to be? The art of wanting without chains begins with the honest examination of where you've converted your preferences into demands. This is interior excavation work. It requires sitting with the question, what things do I believe I cannot be okay without? The answer is rarely material. It's almost always relational or experiential. The approval of a specific person, the success of a specific outcome, the belief that a specific relationship will continue in a specific form, the certainty that the future will look a particular way. These things matter. Some of them matter enormously. The practice isn't to stop caring about them. The practice is to investigate the claim that you cannot be okay if they don't materialize. Because that claim, when you actually examine it, is almost never accurate. Human beings have survived the loss of nearly everything and reconstituted themselves. The people you know who have been through genuinely devastating experiences, the ones you thought would break them, often turn out, after time, to be more whole than before. Not because they stopped caring about what they lost, but because they discovered that they themselves existed independent of what they lost. That discovery is what wanting without chains produces when the unchained desire is frustrated, the capacity to survive the frustration without being shattered by it. In practical terms, the practice looks like this. When you notice you are intensely wanting something, approval from someone whose opinion matters to you, a specific outcome in a situation you can't fully control, a particular response from someone you care about, pause and consciously examine the wanting. Acknowledge it fully. Don't suppress it or pretend it doesn't exist. Then ask, if this doesn't materialize, what actually happens? Not the fear's answer, but the honest answer. Usually the honest answer is, something will be genuinely disappointing or painful, and I will be okay anyway. The disappointment or pain is real. The I will not be okay is the fear speaking, not the truth. Practicing this examination repeatedly builds the emotional muscle of wanting without chains. It doesn't eliminate the desire. It separates the desire from the demand, and in that separation creates the possibility of full engagement without desperate grasping. Apply this to love. You can love someone with your full capacity while simultaneously releasing the demand that they love you back in exactly the way you need. This doesn't mean tolerating mistreatment or accepting relationships that don't meet your genuine needs. It means that your ability to love and the quality of that love doesn't depend on perfect reciprocation to remain intact. This is love as a practice rather than a transaction. It's offering care as an expression of who you are rather than as an investment that requires specific returns. And it's the most durable, most genuine form of love that exists. Emergency protocols. What to do when everything hits at once. Even with everything you've learned in this audiobook, even with months or years of consistent practice, there will be moments when you get hit so hard, so fast, that your defenses don't have time to engage. The crisis call at 2 a.m., the diagnosis you didn't see coming, the conversation that detonates something you thought was stable, the loss that hits before you've had a chance to prepare for it. These moments are not failures of the system. They're the moments the system was built for, and they require a specific set of responses, psychological first aid protocols, designed for acute emotional emergency rather than the chronic everyday practice we've been developing. The first and most important emergency protocol is what we'll call the pause and anchor sequence. When an acute emotional storm arrives, your prefrontal cortex, your capacity for rational response, begins to go offline. The amygdala is flooding the system, and the thinking brain loses functional access. Your job in the first minutes of an emotional emergency is to prevent the complete shutdown of rational function and maintain enough stability to keep from making things worse. The anchor is your breath. Specifically, slow, deliberate, extended exhales. The exhale phase of the breath cycle activates the parasympathetic nervous system, the counterforce to the stress response. When you extend your exhale to approximately twice the length of your inhale, breathing in for 4 counts, out for 8, you're directly engaging the biological mechanism that reduces amygdala activation. This is not meditation. This is physiology. You're using a reliable biological switch to reduce the intensity of the physiological emergency response, giving your prefrontal cortex time to come back online. While breathing, anchor yourself to simple factual statements, not reassurances, facts. I am safe right now. This is a difficult moment and it will change. I have gotten through hard things before. These statements don't minimize what's happening. They establish stable ground underneath the storm. The second emergency protocol is the fact-story separation. When in crisis, the most common form of cognitive distortion is the seamless merger of what is actually happening with the most catastrophic possible interpretation of what is happening. This merger feels like clarity. It feels like you're finally seeing the truth of the situation. Usually, you're seeing the fear's version of the situation, not the accurate version. The practice is to force a separation. On paper or stated out loud, list only what you can verify has actually occurred. Not what it might mean, not what might happen next, not what this says about you or your future, just the facts. What happened, what was said, what is concretely known right now. Everything else, the projected consequences, the implications for the future, the meaning for your identity, the worst-case scenarios, is interpretation. It may contain some accuracy. In the acute phase of emotional emergency, you are not in a good position to evaluate its accuracy. Get to facts first. The third emergency protocol is kinetic release. Intense emotion is a whole-body event, not just a mental one. The stress hormones flooding your system are preparing your body for physical action. If that action doesn't happen, if you sit still with the emotional intensity, the physiological activation persists and amplifies. Physical movement metabolizes the stress chemistry. Walk, run, do push-ups. Anything that engages your muscles and creates genuine physical exertion, not as distraction, as chemistry. You are changing the biochemical conditions of your experience. The fourth emergency protocol is the 90-second ride. Recall from Chapter 3. The physiological component of an emotional wave lasts approximately 90 seconds when you don't re-trigger it. In an acute crisis, you may have many of these waves, one after another, for an extended period. The practice is not to stop them. Let them arrive. They're real. They're appropriate. And suppressing them creates its own problems. Instead, let the wave arrive, ride it for its natural duration, breathe, and notice when it begins to naturally subside. Between waves, you have a window for rational engagement. Use those windows for the practices above. Over time, and this timeline varies depending on the severity of what you're facing, the waves become less frequent, less intense, and the windows between them become longer. The fifth emergency protocol is access to preparation. If you've been practicing the principles in this audiobook consistently, you have resources that will activate in crisis even when you feel like you have nothing. The breathing technique will work because you've practiced it. The fact-story separation will be available because you've trained the habit. The temporal perspective will be accessible because you've developed it. This is the purpose of the daily practice, not just for the ordinary days when managing your emotions is simply good hygiene, but for the extraordinary days when everything you've built gets tested at once. You will get through those days. People always do, once they stop fighting the fact that they're having them and start using the tools that were built precisely for this. Relationships from strength. How to connect deeply without losing yourself. The greatest myth about emotional strength is that it makes you worse at relationships, that becoming less reactive, less approval dependent, less emotionally volatile will make you colder, more disconnected, harder to reach. The evidence suggests precisely the opposite. The research on what actually makes relationships work consistently across cultures, relationship types, and demographic categories points to a quality called secure attachment. People with secure attachment can be close without becoming fused, can care without becoming controlling, can be hurt without being shattered, can offer love without requiring it to be returned in exactly the right form to remain intact. This is not a personality type you're born with. It's a functional state that's produced by emotional self-sufficiency. Exactly what this audiobook has been building, and it generates the most stable, nourishing, and genuinely intimate relationships available to human beings. The insecure alternatives, anxious attachment, which grasps and demands, and avoidant attachment, which distances and withholds, are both produced by the same underlying problem: insufficient internal stability. Anxious attachment reaches outward desperately for the stability it can't generate internally. Avoidant attachment walls off connection to prevent the pain that comes from depending on something external for inner stability. Both are responses to the same deficit. Build internal stability, the four pillars, the observer perspective, the unchained wanting, and you create the conditions for secure attachment naturally. Not as a technique, as a consequence of who you've become. What does emotionally strong relationship practice actually look like? It begins with what we might call full presence, without fusion. The ability to be completely with another person, genuinely attentive, genuinely responsive, genuinely there, without merging with their emotional state. When someone you care about is suffering, you can be with them in their suffering without becoming a victim of their suffering. You remain the stable presence because you remain yourself. This distinction matters enormously in close relationships. The partner who gets swept into panic every time their person is panicking provides the illusion of empathy while actually reducing the stability available in the partnership. Two panicking people have less than one stable one and one panicking one. Being the one who stays grounded when your partner is overwhelmed is not emotional distance. It's the most useful form of care. Boundaries from value rather than from fear. Most people who struggle with boundaries either enforce them too rigidly from fear of losing themselves in the relationship, or fail to enforce them at all from fear of rejection or conflict. The stoically grounded approach to boundaries is neither. A boundary, properly understood, is simply a statement of what you are and are not available for, rooted in your values and your honest assessment of what you need to function well, rather than in what you fear. Stated from this place, boundaries are neither aggressive nor apologetic. They're clear. They invite honest response from the other person rather than managing their reaction. They don't require the other person to agree with them to be valid, and they don't collapse under social pressure because they're rooted in something more stable than social approval. Love as expression, not transaction. The transactional model of love, I give this, I expect that in return, the deficit is logged and generates resentment, is the most common relational pattern and the most consistently destructive. It converts connection into commerce, turns generosity into scorekeeping, and eventually produces two people who feel fundamentally unseen by each other. The alternative is love as an expression of your character rather than as an investment in specific returns. You show up fully, not because you've calculated what you'll get back, but because this is who you've chosen to be. The quality of relationship this produces is categorically different from what transaction generates. It's the difference between connection and performance. This doesn't mean accepting mistreatment indefinitely or staying in relationships that are consistently harmful. It means that within relationships that are fundamentally good, your contribution isn't conditional on perfect reciprocation. And it means that when you assess whether a relationship is worth continuing, you're doing it from a clear-eyed place, rather than from the distorted perspective of someone who desperately needs the relationship to succeed. Deep honesty from a calm place. The most important conversations in your relationships, the ones about things that aren't working, the ones about needs that aren't being met, the ones about fears and doubts, and the things you've been not saying. Those conversations are most productive when initiated from a state of genuine calm rather than emotional reactivity. Not suppressed emotion. Genuine equilibrium. The ability to say, I need to tell you something that matters to me, without that conversation being an attack, a demand, or a crisis. This kind of communication is a direct function of internal stability. It's available to you in direct proportion to how consistently you've practiced the principles in this audiobook. The daily architecture installing emotional invulnerability as your default setting. A philosophy that you read once and find inspiring changes almost nothing. A philosophy that you practice every day changes everything. The gap between understanding these principles and living them is bridged by only one thing: consistent daily practice. Not intense periodic effort, not occasional bursts of discipline. The slow, steady, compounding effect of choosing differently, day by day, until the new choice becomes automatic. Here's how to build a daily architecture that makes emotional invulnerability your default operating system, rather than your best performance. The morning calibration, 5 to 10 minutes. Before you check your phone, before you engage with the demands of the day, before any external input has oriented your attention outward, spend a few minutes orienting inward. What is your intention for today in terms of how you want to respond to difficulty? Not what you plan to accomplish, how you intend to be. This distinction matters. What you accomplish is subject to 1,000 variables outside your control. How you respond is always, in principle, your choice. Identify 1 or 2 specific situations you expect to encounter today that are likely to trigger automatic reactions. The difficult colleague, the uncertain outcome, the conversation you've been avoiding. For each, briefly run through what you've learned. What interpretations might your automatic system generate? What would a more accurate and useful interpretation look like? What would the wisest version of you choose to feel and do in that moment? This preparation creates a neural preload. You've rehearsed the response before the stimulus arrives. The gap between stimulus and response widens slightly because you've already partially traversed it. Read or listen to a few sentences from a philosophical or psychological source that reinforces the framework you're building, not for information, for recalibration. The same way athletes warm up the same movements daily even when they've done those movements 10,000 times. Because the body and mind both benefit from regular preparation, regardless of expertise. The midday check, 2 to 3 minutes. Once during the day, pause. Note your current emotional state, accurately and specifically. Note any situations that have triggered automatic reactions. Note whether you used the choice point, and if not, what interpretation fired and what would have been more accurate. This is not self-criticism. It's the practice of honest self-observation. The same practice that the Stoics engaged in during their evening reflections, which Marcus Aurelius did in the pages of Meditations and Seneca described in his letters. The Stoic tradition was emphatic. Daily self-examination is not optional peripheral activity. It is the central practice. The evening review, 5 minutes. Before sleep, review your day's emotional responses, not to catalog failures, but to extract learning. 3 questions. Where did I choose my response rather than react automatically? Where did I react automatically, and what interpretation fired that I could have examined? What will I do differently tomorrow? This review should be honest and should be brief. The goal is not extended self-analysis, but a clean daily feedback loop. The same mechanism that allows athletes to improve faster when they have consistent, specific performance feedback than when they simply train without review. The difficulty, reframe. This is a practice to apply in real time whenever you encounter resistance, frustration, or challenge. The practice is simply this. Before responding to the difficulty, ask the question that reframes it from problem to training. What is this developing in me? not as a way to bypass genuine problem solving, as a layer of perspective underneath the problem solving. The difficulty is real and requires a response, and simultaneously it's an opportunity to practice the quality that responding to it well will require. Traffic jams practice patience and present moment acceptance. Difficult people practice equanimity and secure self-possession. Unexpected changes practice adaptability and letting go of attachment to plans. None of these are enjoyable. All of them are training. When you see your daily obstacles not as disruptions to your equanimity, but as the very curriculum through which equanimity is built, the texture of ordinary frustrating days transforms significantly. Not because the obstacles become less annoying, because you've stopped relating to annoyance as an enemy and started treating it as a teacher. The environment design. Surround yourself as much as possible with the ideas and people that reinforce what you're building. This doesn't mean a bubble. It means being intentional. The inputs you absorb daily, the media you consume, the conversations you engage in, the content that occupies your attention, shape your thinking more than you probably recognize. Design your environment to support your development rather than to continuously pull you back into the reactive patterns you're working to change. Seek out people who demonstrate the qualities you want to develop, not for inspiration alone, for modeling. The fastest way to install a new pattern of behavior is to regularly observe someone for whom that behavior is already natural. Find mentors, whether personal or through their work, who have demonstrated genuine emotional mastery, and study them. Be patient with yourself. The timeline for genuine, stable change in deeply ingrained emotional patterns is months and years, not days and weeks. The progress is rarely linear. There are periods of apparent regression, old patterns reasserting themselves under new stresses that are entirely normal and not evidence that the system doesn't work. Progress in this domain is measured not by whether you always respond perfectly, but by whether the average quality of your responses is gradually improving, and whether the recovery time after setbacks is gradually shortening. Those two metrics, tracked honestly over months, will show you something remarkable. Beyond the shield from protecting yourself to empowering everyone around you. At the beginning of this audiobook, the promise was simple. You would learn an ancient system that could make you emotionally invulnerable. A shield for the mind built from 2,000 years of tested wisdom and confirmed by the most sophisticated neuroscience available today. That promise has been kept. But as you develop genuine mastery of these principles, not intellectual understanding, but lived fluency, something unexpected begins to happen. The goal shifts. You stop thinking primarily about protecting yourself from pain. You start thinking about what becomes possible when you're no longer spending most of your energy on protection. The answer, it turns out, is everything. When you're not constantly managing emotional reactivity, you have enormous reserves available for creative, generative engagement with life. When you're not dependent on external approval, you can take the risks that actually matter. The honest conversations, the ambitious pursuits, the authentic expressions that require genuine vulnerability rather than performed confidence. When you're not frightened of what life might bring you, you become willing to engage fully with what it does bring you. You take bigger swings. You love with less calculation. You show up more completely in every room you enter. Not because nothing can hurt you, but because you know that whatever hurts you, you can navigate. And that knowledge changes everything about how you move through the world. There is also something that happens to the people around you when you become genuinely stable. Stability is contagious in a way that's often underestimated. The person who doesn't panic in the crisis changes the emotional climate of every room they're in. The person who can be honest without being aggressive raises the quality of every conversation they engage in. The person who loves freely without keeping score elevates the experience of everyone who is loved by them. You become a resource rather than a drain. Not because you're performing wellness, but because the genuine inner work produces a genuine inner surplus that naturally overflows into everything you touch. The ancient philosophers didn't develop these practices to become cold, or distant, or invulnerable in the sense of being untouchable. They developed them to become capable of serving fully, capable of leading under pressure, capable of loving without loss of self, capable of engaging with the full, difficult, beautiful complexity of human life without being undone by it. Marcus Aurelius ruled an empire and experienced profound personal loss, the deaths of children, the betrayals of trusted advisors, the endless weight of decisions whose consequences could cost thousands of lives. He practiced Stoic philosophy every single day, not to escape these realities, but to remain present with them, to face them without being consumed by them, to make the best decisions available to him in each moment, regardless of how much the previous moment had cost him. That's the true destination of this work, not a life without difficulty, a life in which difficulty cannot diminish your essential strength, peace, or commitment to the things that matter. Not a life without pain. A life in which pain becomes part of the texture of a fully inhabited existence, rather than something that takes you out of the game. Not a life without connection, or vulnerability, or risk. A life in which you can pursue all of these things fearlessly, because you know, with the certainty that only practice can produce, that you will be okay whatever happens. The shield isn't meant to lock you inside. It's meant to free you to step outside fully, without armor, without walls, without the exhausting vigilance of someone who is perpetually afraid of being broken. Go out there and engage with your life as if you were unbreakable. Because with practice, with patience, with the principles you now carry, you very nearly are. The ancient trick to never get hurt again is not a trick at all. It is the oldest, most tested, most reliable truth in human psychology. You cannot control what happens. You can control what you make it mean. And what you make things mean determines everything. Your suffering or your strength, your paralysis or your freedom, the life you endure or the life you choose. Master that. Practice it daily. Give it everything you've got, and you will discover what the wisest minds in human history have always known. Real power lives inside. It always has. It always will. The rest is just weather.